Hi everyone, I'm Zach Weiss, co-founder of Worn and Wound, and today I'll be reviewing the Grand Seiko SBGA375. This is my own watch, a watch that I've had in my collection for about a year and a half, so I have quite a lot to say about it. The Grand Seiko SBGA375 is from the Heritage Collection and is based on the 44GS case. It's one of many watches in that family. It's probably the most extensive family actually in Grand Seiko's line, currently consisting of almost every single movement that Grand Seiko makes, I believe except for the Spring Drive chronograph. When I set out a year and a half ago to purchase a Grand Seiko, my first, and at the time I figured my only Grand Seiko, I started with the notion that I wanted to get a Spring Drive. I'd never had a Spring Drive, and the idea of the mix of mechanical and quartz elements to create this sort of thing that's sort of better than both in some ways just clicked in my mind as an experience that I wanted to have, and sounded like a great way to get into Grand Seiko, which is a brand that I had admired for some time. So I went about looking into what watches had Spring Drives and very quickly settled on the 44GS case as the case that I was interested in sort of like sticking to. Now, the reason for that is because in addition to Spring Drive, there were a few other things that I really wanted out of a Grand Seiko. And one was a case that really had a distinct grammar of design flavor. And I don't think personally that any other cases do this quite as well as the 44GS does. Many of their watch cases are examples of their grammar of design and show really, beautiful finishing and everything like that. But the 44GS case, which is based on the original kind of signature Grand Seiko design from 1967, just really has it in spades. That can be seen in the wide faceted Zaratsu polished surfaces and sort of an overall aggressive faceted design of the case. It was aggressive, and to me, part of what I really like about it is that it doesn't look like the type of case that would really ever come out of a big Swiss brand or anything like that. So it just really feels like a Grand Seiko case. However, the other thing that I really wanted was a textured dial. Now, if you follow along with Grand Seiko, you'll know that their textured dials are kind of something that is very special about the brand, and something that they really put a lot of focus on. They have their snowflake dials, they have dials based on various other natural design concepts, lots of different graining and texturing. It's really, a signature of the brand, like I said. But the time when I was looking for this watch, there just wasn't a regular Grand Seiko 44GS Spring Drive model that featured a textured dial. There had previously been a limited edition, but it was no longer available, unfortunately. So the two watches that were available had sunray finishes, and that was the SBGA 375 that you see here with a midnight blue dial, and the 373, I believe, which had sort of a champagne dial. I was thinking, did I come all this way? Did I go through all this kind of this journey of looking into all this to get a simple sunray dial? So I went and I looked it in the store, and I tried it on, and I decided that even though it was a little bit simpler perhaps than what I originally set out for, it had still had the 44GS case, and more importantly, it had the Spring Drive movement. So I decided to go for it, and I am very happy that I did. I think the 375 is actually a really great entry point into the Grand Seiko collection, getting you a lot of what Grand Seiko has to offer, perhaps except for a wild texture. And more importantly, it's not a limited edition. So this is a core model that is in their collection. Still is to this date. I don't know if it will always be, but it is currently kind of a core model. So getting into the 44GS case, once again, at the time that I purchased this watch, there was really only one size 44GS case in terms of diameter. The thicknesses change depending on the movement in it. And so the case is measured all 40 millimeters in diameter, about 46.2 millimeters lug to lug, and in the case of the Spring Drive movement, 12.5 millimeters thick. Now, I'll admit, when I first saw those dimensions, I also was a little bit taken aback. I prefer everyday watches, particularly watches that are not like very sporty, to be in the 38 to 36 millimeter range. And as this was a more expensive watch, a watch with really, kind of exceptional finishing to it, I was thinking of it as being a more formal piece as well, which also would lend itself to being a little bit smaller. However, as we've said a few times, the numbers aren't all that matters. So having tried on the watch in the Grand Seiko boutique, my concerns began to dissipate. And the more I've worn the watch, the more I've realized that honestly, my initial notion of it being really like a formal watch were just incorrect. This is a somewhat conservative everyday watch with actually a very sporty build to it. It's 100 meters, it has an oversized screw down crown on it. It's really actually meant to take kind of a beating of everyday life. And as you can plainly see from my watch here, which I've worn, like I said, for a year and a half, it's gotten quite a bit of a beating. You know, like I said, I wear this watch weekly, several times a week. When I first got it, I wore it probably every day for the first few months. Barring when I wasn't reviewing another watch. And I've dinged it, I've nicked it, I've scuffed it, I've scratched it, I even put a little dent somehow into the bezel. I don't really remember doing any of that, but it's there. It still works very well, and I think honestly looks a little bit more beautiful for it. That said, when you first get a 44GS case in your possession and open up the box, it is a thing of surreal beauty. The way that the Zaratsu polished surfaces look is just uncanny. They almost look like they don't exist at all, like they're windows into a world, like you're looking almost at a piece of crystal, perhaps. Only as those surfaces begin to build up with little hairline scratches and dust do they become more apparent. That's all because of the incredible Zaratsu polished surface area here. So I'm not sure if other Grand Seiko watches have quite the same amount of surface area of Zaratsu polishing, but it really goes a long way in making the 44GS case look quite special. So these wide flanks on the side here, this whole entire region is Zaratsu polished. So it's a little bit deceptive to look at flat like this, but as you see when you start to curve the watch, that surface arcs around from one end of the watch all the way to the other, but stays completely flat on an angle away from your face. Had that been angled up towards you, you'd be looking at yourself every time you looked at the watch. So thankfully, it's facing away from you. And it gives you this just really beautiful, reflection on it. I'm not honestly the hugest fan usually of polished surfaces on watches or overly polished watches, but it's just different here. But the design is also just full of really wonderful moments and really cool little design elements that I feel like at first glance you miss, but as you live with the watch, you get to find. So some are these brushed elements that you can see here between the lugs. This is actually a vestige of the original 44GS case, which had more of a squared off lug design. So there would have been a plane connecting those points. But now they've left it, and they've just left these brushed lines on the inside of the lug here, which run all the way down, almost like connecting it to the back of the watch. It's very unusual to see a brushed detail like that, particularly in that location. It's something I really quite enjoy about the watch. Additionally, there's a brushed line running down the middle of the side of the watch. And this is actually the only vertical wall on the watch as well. It's beautifully brushed and it really accentuates the polishing, particularly above it, but also helps break up that 12.5 millimeter thickness that I mentioned before. That sounds pretty thick, I'm not gonna lie, it's not thin, but Grand Seiko's geometry and just the level of tapering and faceting on this watch make it fit very well, so it doesn't feel like a thick watch, in my opinion. There are a few more details on this watch that I really love and that have kind of come out as I've worn it more. One is how the lug crests up to meet the mid case here. There's just a little ridge where it comes up above the bezel. It's a subtle little detail that just sort of breaks up the lines of the watch. And the other is where all of the faces of the watch resolve on the ends of the lugs. There's, I don't even know, probably like 6 or so faces here, each shaped perfectly to resolve the various lines and facets that come in, including Zaratsu polishing finish and brushing on them. And this is all, executed by hand. So you'll see as you look at it, they're not perfectly the same between each side, and that's like a little of that kind of wabi-sabi that comes from hand finishing. And I don't know, I just absolutely adore that detail. I love knowing the level of craft that has gone into this watch. While the case holds sort of an endless amount of detail to enjoy, the dial is no slouch. Like I said, I was originally perhaps a little concerned about getting a Grand Seiko that had such a simple dial. It was an expensive watch, and like I said, Grand Seiko is known for all their wonderful textures, so blue sunray just didn't sound exciting on paper. However, it is a really, really beautiful blue sunray, like no other. So the dial consists of this single main surface. There is no chaptering or anything like that, and it's a dark, inky midnight blue. In some light, it looks straight black. Like if you're indoors and it's not very well lit, the dial will look black. In medium lighting, sort of like this, you'll see that there is a sort of a blue ray coming out of the middle. But unlike other sun rays, it's not coarse looking. You don't see sort of edges to those rays. They just sort of blend out into blackness. And then when you're out in the sun, in direct sunlight, you're going to get a very bright kind of piercing blue, but that's only in direct sunlight. So it has this really kind of wonderful dynamic nature to it. By being a little simpler, it's actually also helped me appreciate perhaps the other detailing on the dial, which might get lost when there is a dramatic texture around. So the dial furniture on this watch is absolutely exceptional. As you can see here, you have applied markers running around the perimeter of the dial, a date window at 3. Those markers are each individually finished to an exceptional degree. So they're faceted on the edges and polished. That picks up little glints of light, giving them a kind of dynamic feel to them as well. And then the top surfaces are actually very finely lined. This is something that can really only be seen under a loupe. I genuinely can't see it with the naked eye, but when you get it under loop, you'll see there's just these super thin ridges. And what that does is help diffuse the light that crosses them, giving them almost like always a bright look. This is a dark dial, so rather than having paint on those markers to stand out, they gave it this treatment. You'll notice actually on Grand Seiko watches that light dials always have polished markers in hands, and dark dials will always have brushed markers or otherwise diffused markers in hands. And this just gives them a lot of contrast. But it's also just an incredibly beautiful detail. Sometimes they actually even pick up light and have a sort of rainbow quality to the way they reflect it back. It's really just unique, and it's not something I've seen on any other watch. There's a date window at 3. It's pretty straightforward. Another detail that perhaps at first I thought, do I really want a date on something that's kind of more of a formal watch, more of a special watch? But like I said, it became an everyday watch. And so having a date on an everyday watch is actually very convenient. So I've grown to appreciate it being there. Under 12, you have the Grand Seiko logo. It's an applied GS within a printed Grand Seiko in silver. This is of the generation after they stopped double branding them. And then off at 7, you have the Power Reserve. The Power Reserve can be a bit contentious in Grand Seiko. Some people love it, some people hate it. I think it sort of depends on the watch as to whether or not it feels appropriate. And on this watch, with that more simple blue dial, I think it works quite well. It's not interrupting anything here. I also actually appreciate having the Power Reserve. This is my only watch with a Power Reserve, so it's another little element that gives it, makes it a little bit special. And it does feature 72 hours of power, which when Grand Seiko first unveiled the Spring Drives was actually kind of above average. So it's something they definitely wanted to flaunt. And the detail in here is also quite beautiful. It's a depressed surface in there with an arcing sort of index that suggests to you whether it's full or empty. Right now, the hand is showing that it is completely full of power. There's something about the shape of the Power Reserve that makes me think of a seashell every time I look at it, which, I don't know, doesn't bother me at all. Lastly, you have the hands here, which I will adjust so you can see better. Grand Seiko's hands are absolutely exceptional and worthy of a lot of attention. So the hour and minute hands have a Dauphine shape to them, very kind of classic and conservative, but the finishing is just absolutely exceptional. So they have polished edges and brushed surfaces, once again brushed to stand out against the dark dial. You can take a loop to your watch and look at those hands and look at that edge, and you will not find a tool mark, you will not find a rough surface. It is absolutely perfect, beyond even what you can see with a loupe. People have also compared these hands to that of high-end Swiss luxury brands and have found that Grand Seikos are, actually far more perfectly executed. It's just one of those things that really makes the watch all the more special, especially at the price point that they are made at. The second hand and Power Reserve hand are a little bit more simple, but they also are quite beautiful. So they're polished sticks in silver. But something that Grand Seiko does that I love and has now made me start to look at other high-end watches and ask why, is they've capped off the center of those hands. So you won't see a hole going through where they attach to the pinion. That's just like a little detail I love that I feel like goes a long way just towards making the watch that much more elegant. As I said before, what drew me first to my interest in Grand Seiko was actually the Spring Drive movement and experiencing that. The Spring Drive is a very complicated concept that I am not going to fully describe for you here. We have other articles on the website. We actually have a whole article and video describing how it works. But what you should basically know is that it has the feel of a mechanical movement with the accuracy of a quartz movement. So the 9R65 is rated to plus minus 15 seconds a month. That's less than a second a day, or plus minus 1 second a day. And in actuality, it is almost hard to notice it veering off at all. Now, when I said I wanted a new experience with this watch and with this movement, It's subtle, of course. It is just telling time with 3 hands, but it is different. When I first set the watch and I hacked it to 60 at the 60 mark and set the time against time.gov, I let it go. And a day later, I looked at it. As the second hand crossed the 60-second mark, I watched as my computer also ticked over the minute exactly at the same moment. And it kept doing that for days and weeks. It only after about a month was it ever so slightly off again. So it really is incredibly accurate and incredibly precise. Then there's also just the joy of the sweep of that hand. Like I said before, it's not a Swiss lever escapement. It's not ticking. It's not ticking very fast either, which could give the illusion of a sweeping hand. It is just a perfectly smooth sweep. It's serene, it's calm, it's incredibly elegant, and frankly, it's more accurate to what the passing of time really is. Time doesn't jump along, it's a constant motion. So in the act of actually wearing this watch, I have to say it felt different than a mechanical watch. It felt different from a quartz watch. It achieved what I was hoping for, and that was a new experience, something a little bit different than the watches I had previously owned. On the wrist, the SBGA375 is an interesting watch. Like I said, when I first went into it, I was hoping for something smaller. But when I tried it on, I did just like it on my wrist, although it was just not what I expected and different. It doesn't wear small. I'm not going to lie to you and say that it feels smaller than 40 millimeters. It doesn't feel small at all. In fact, I'd say it feels, fairly sizable. It has thick metal lugs. It has a wide dial. There's a lot of surface area. It's bold and it has a lot of presence. That said, it's not a loud watch. It's not an ostentatious watch. It has actually a fairly conservative aesthetic, I would say, in many ways. But it has a lot of presence. It also is fairly comfortable on the wrist because it does have a shorter lug to lug at 46.2 millimeters, and the thickness, which while 12.5 millimeters, as you can see, the tapering on the back, it allows your wrist to kind of flex around it, and the whole thing is coming up or down. There's very little vertical surface area on that. So it does look and wear thinner. I would say almost like you could measure it to where the case back starts, rather than all the way to the end of the case back, which would shave off a couple of millimeters. But once again, not small at all. But in terms of looks, I just absolutely love this thing. It is a very interesting looking watch. It has so many elements to it that are, worth poring over. No other watch feels like this in my collection. The faceted sides, the polished surfaces, the intricacy of the tiniest little details on the dial, and then the depth of that midnight blue. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And luckily, it's also a strap monster. So something I should say is that this watch comes on a bracelet. And I don't have it here because this is about my watch and how I've worn it. And I've never worn the bracelet. I didn't even size the bracelet. I bought the watch, I took the bracelet off. It's in mint condition in the box that it came in. And that's because, to me, this case is all about those lugs and those faceted shapes, and filling in that lug with the end link of the bracelet just didn't feel right. I wanted to accentuate it, not take away from it. The bracelet is of obviously very high quality. Grand Seiko's bracelets are very high quality, but they're also all very similar to each other. So if you've seen a Grand Seiko bracelet, it's in that same style. And I don't know if it necessarily perfectly matches the 44GS case, but you have a 19 millimeter lug here, and the watch is an absolute strap monster. So here I have it on a taupe strap with some texturing. This is a little bit more of a formal option. I've worn it on leather straps with much thicker build quality to it. You'll see it on a green strap in my review. I've even worn it on 19 millimeter mill straps, which I did almost as a joke when I got it. I put it on there and figured, I'll try it out. And that is how I wear it in the summer. This watch takes to that strap so beautifully and just brings out a sportier side to it, which, like I said, when I first picked up this watch, I didn't expect for it to have. Versatility is very important to me, I think, especially when I'm actually spending money on a watch. And the versatility of the SBGA 375 is very high. So that, to me, just really adds to the value of it. To wrap up, the Grand Seiko SBGA 375 is a watch that I think has taken me by surprise. Like I said, I bought it because I wanted to experience the Spring Drive movement. I decided the 44GS case was the way to go. I had a little bit of concern about getting a simple dial from Grand Seiko. Ultimately, I think it's come together to be sort of the perfect way to get into the brand. This is an extremely versatile watch. The blue dial I'd liken to wearing a blazer or blue jeans. It's extremely easy to work with. You can wear it all the time. And though I didn't expect to, I have worn this watch all the time. This was supposed to be a special occasion watch. It has turned into an everyday watch, and I think that's a compliment to the watch itself and to the design. It's not something you want to take off the wrist. It feels robust and sturdy. It feels like it can put up with my life. And like I've said, I've dinged it enough to suggest that it certainly can. The only element we haven't really discussed yet is, of course, the price of the Grand Seiko SBGA 375. So it is currently $5,200. Now, that is obviously not an inexpensive watch. It is quite expensive, but I think this watch offers just so much that it is still an incredible value. When you look at Swiss watches in the $5,200 range, I don't think you're going to find many with this level of fit and finish on the dial, this level of hand finish in the case, and a completely novel movement that is accurate to, like I said, plus minus 15 seconds. In fact, nothing except for quartz compares to that, so the Spring Drive really is always an exceptional value. So if you're interested in Grand Seiko, if you're interested in Spring Drive, and you don't necessarily know where to begin, I highly recommend doing what I did and going for the SBGA 375. I think it's a wonderful introduction to the brand, everything it has to offer, on a watch that will probably become one of your favorites like mine. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to head to wornandwound.com to read the full written review. Thank you.